These questions had no answers. Then a Viennese doctor made a shocking discovery. Our minds are mostly hidden from us, filled with forbidden thoughts and repressed memories that control our lives from the shadows. Tonight, we'll trace the path of Sigmund Freud, a remarkable figure who dared to explore the darkest corners of the human soul. From his complicated childhood to his final days in exile, this is the story of how one person's obsession with understanding the mind changed civilization forever. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps other curious souls discover these stories. And let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like us to explore next. So, get comfy, settle in, and let's travel back to where it all began. This is the bedtime biography of Sigmund Freud. Chapter 1. A Greed for Knowledge. Our story begins in 1856, in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, a place where the hills rolled gently toward the horizon, and the air smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread. On May 6th, in a modest apartment above a blacksmith's shop, a baby's first cry pierced the spring afternoon. His name would be Sigmund Freud, though he'd later trim it down to the cleaner, more German-sounding Sigmund. Even the circumstances of his birth were complicated. His father Jacob was 40 years old, already grandfather to children older than his new wife. His mother, Amalia, was just 21, beautiful and fierce, with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through people. She would always insist that her firstborn was destined for greatness. Mothers have a way of knowing these things, she'd say, especially when the child is born with a call. The family constellation was dizzyingly complex. Young Sigmund had half-brothers old enough to be his father, and a nephew who was actually his senior. Try explaining that at school. His playmate and companion was his nephew John, and their relationship swung wildly between affection and rivalry, a pattern that would echo through Freud's entire life. When Sigmund was 3, something peculiar happened. His Catholic nursemaid, a woman who filled his head with stories of heaven and hell, suddenly vanished, disappeared like smoke. Years later, he'd discover she'd been caught stealing and sent to prison. But for the little boy, she simply ceased to exist, taking with her the vivid world of saints and demons she'd painted in his imagination. Then came the move to Vienna in 1860. The Freuds, like so many Jewish families, were chasing opportunity in the grand capital of the Habsburg Empire. They squeezed into a series of cramped apartments, Jacob's business ventures always teetering on the edge of failure. But Amalia never let poverty dim her ambitions for her golden child. At school, Sigmund devoured books like a starving man devours bread. Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, English. Languages piled up in his mind like treasures in a vault. He read Shakespeare in the original before he was 10. His teachers watched in amazement as this intense boy with a penetrating gaze consistently topped every class. But it wasn't just academic success that marked these early years. There was something else, a quality his family would later call his greed for knowledge. He didn't just want to learn things, he wanted to understand them, to get inside them, to discover what made them tick. Whether it was the structure of an ancient Greek verb, or the reasons behind his sister's tears, young Sigmund had to know. By 1873, this hunger had led him to a decision that would shape everything that followed. Medicine, he announced. He would study medicine at the University of Vienna. Chapter 2: The Lure of Research. The University of Vienna in 1873 was a temple of learning, wrapped in cigarette smoke and animated by fierce debate. Young Freud climbed its marble steps that first October morning with the kind of anticipation that makes your stomach flutter. He was 17, brilliant, and Jewish. That last fact mattering more than he'd like to admit. The lecture halls were vast amphitheaters where professors thundered about the new scientific age. Darwin's ideas crackled through the air like electricity. Everything could be explained, measured, dissected. God was being politely shown the door, while microscopes and test tubes took center stage. But it was a public reading of Goethe's essay On Nature that truly set Freud's course. The speaker's voice rose and fell like music as he described nature as a mysterious woman, forever creating new forms. She has thought, and she meditates constantly. The essay proclaimed. Sitting in that crowded hall, Freud felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just poetry, it was a calling. Still, medical school proved to be a winding path rather than a straight road. Freud kept getting distracted. Philosophy lectures with Franz Brentano, where they wrestled with the nature of consciousness. Zoology courses, where he spent months examining the sex organs of eels, 400 eels to be precise, searching for their elusive testes. His fellow students were already seeing patients, while Freud was still peering through microscopes at fish gonads. Then came Ernst Brücke. Imagine a Prussian officer who'd traded his sword for a scalpel. That was Brücke. Steel blue eyes, ramrod posture, and a mind like a perfectly calibrated instrument. His physiological laboratory in the Gewehrfabrik was Freud's true university, a place where the poetry of life met the precision of science. Under Brücke's demanding gaze, Freud found his element. He studied the nerve cells of crayfish, spending hours hunched over his microscope, mapping the delicate fibers that carried messages through primitive nervous systems. The work was meticulous, exhausting, thrilling. Here was the machinery of life itself, laid bare under glass. For 6 years, Freud lived in this world of cells and slides. He published papers with titles like On the Origin of the Posterior Nerve, Roots in the Spinal Cord of Amocoites. Not exactly bestseller material, but each discovery felt like decoding a secret message from nature herself. Yet even in Brücke's temple of pure science, reality had a way of intruding. Freud was poor. His father's business ventures kept failing. His mother's faith in his destiny didn't pay the rent. And in 1882, something happened that would force him out of his laboratory paradise. Her name was Martha Bernays, and she changed everything. Chapter 3. Freud in Love. April 1882. A friend's house in Vienna, where the gas lamps cast a warm glow over the evening gathering. Freud was 26, all dark intensity and nervous energy, when Martha Bernays walked into the room. She was 21, slender, with intelligent eyes, and a way of tilting her head when she listened that suggested she actually heard what you were saying. 2 months. That's all it took. By June, Freud was writing letters that practically scorched the paper. I knew it was only after you that I would need my breath, he told her. The man who'd spent years dissecting crayfish nerves was suddenly composing poetry that would have made his scientific mentors cringe. But love, like everything else in Freud's life, came with complications. Martha's family didn't approve. Her mother whisked her away to Wandsbek near Hamburg, 500 miles between them. In an age before telephones, this meant letters. Hundreds and hundreds of letters. And what letters they were. Freud didn't just write to Martha. He commanded, pleaded, raged, philosophized. He was jealous of her cousins, her friends, even her mother. When she mentioned enjoying a piece by the writer Fritz Reuter, Freud exploded. How dare she admire another man's work? The letters grew so intense that Martha sometimes had to hide them from her family. Meanwhile, practical reality loomed like a stern parent. Brücke, his beloved mentor, had taken him aside with some brutal honesty. 2 assistants ahead of him in the laboratory, both with independent incomes. At this rate, Freud would be 40 before he could support a wife. My dear friend, Brücke said, those steel blue eyes softening just a fraction. It's time to leave the laboratory. So Freud entered Vienna General Hospital in July 1882. From the pristine world of microscopes to the chaos of the wards, patients crying out, the smell of carbolic acid and human suffering, the endless parade of disease and death. He rotated through departments like a man trying on ill-fitting clothes. Surgery, internal medicine, psychiatry, dermatology. None of it felt right. Then came cocaine. The drug arrived in his life like a revelation in 1884. This white powder from South America. It banished fatigue, lifted depression, made him feel like he could conquer the world. He sent some to Martha, prescribed it to patients, wrote papers singing its praises. A magical substance, he called it. The magic turned dark when his friend Ernst Fleischl became addicted. Freud had given him cocaine to ease his morphine withdrawal. Instead, it created a new hell. Fleischl, crawling on the floor, convinced insects were burrowing under his skin. The guilt would haunt Freud for years. But in 1885, a travel grant offered escape. Paris beckoned, and with it, the legendary Jean-Martin Charcot. Chapter 4: Hysterics and the Seduction Theory. The story that changed everything began before Freud even entered it. December 1880, a young woman named Bertha Pappenheim, brilliant, imaginative, trapped in the suffocating world of Viennese propriety, fell mysteriously ill while nursing her dying father. Her symptoms read like a Gothic novel: paralysis, hallucinations, inability to speak her native German while chattering away in English, French, and Italian. Joseph Breuer, Freud's older colleague and friend, had treated her. What he discovered was extraordinary. When Bertha talked about her symptoms, really talked, following each strange thread back to its source, they began to disappear. She called it chimney sweeping, this process of clearing out the dark corners of her mind. Breuer called it the cathartic method. Bertha herself would later coin the phrase that would echo through history: the talking cure. By 1893, Freud had convinced Breuer to write up the case. They called her Anna O in their published study, though the disguise was tissue-thin. The medical establishment's response was predictable: raised eyebrows, polite coughs, the kind of silence that speaks volumes. Talking as treatment? Where were the prescriptions, the electrical currents, the water cures? But Freud was already pushing beyond Breuer's cautious boundaries. His own patients, mostly young women from good families, suffering from mysterious ailments that defied medical explanation, were telling him things that made even him uncomfortable. Behind their symptoms, again and again, he found stories of sexual encounters in childhood, uncles who came too close, fathers who entered bedrooms at night, trusted family friends who betrayed that trust in unspeakable ways. By 1896, Freud had formulated his seduction theory. The name itself was a Victorian euphemism. What he really meant was that neurosis was caused by childhood sexual abuse. Every hysterical symptom, he argued, could be traced back to these early traumas, buried like unexploded bombs in the unconscious mind. He presented his findings to the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna that April. Picture the scene. Distinguished doctors in their dark suits, pocket watches gleaming, as Freud outlined how their respectable society was riddled with child abuse. The chairman, Baron Richard von Krafft-Ebing, delivered his verdict with icy precision. It sounds like a scientific fairy tale. The isolation was total. Referrals dried up. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him, but Freud pressed on, convinced he'd found the key to human suffering. until the doubts began to creep in like fog under a door. The stories his patients told, were they memories or fantasies? Could there really be this much abuse hidden behind Vienna's respectable facades? By September 1897, writing to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, Freud confessed his devastating realization: I no longer believe in my neurotica. The theory was dead, but from its ashes, something far more disturbing would rise. Chapter 5: Self-Analysis and the Interpretation of Dreams. October 15th, 1896. A telegram arrived at Freud's summer holiday address. Father died peacefully. The words seemed to float off the page. Jacob Freud, that complicated mixture of failure and dignity, was gone. At the funeral, as rain drummed on black umbrellas, something cracked open inside Sigmund. Not just grief, but a strange, vertiginous feeling, as if the ground beneath his feet had become unreliable. The dreams started almost immediately. His father, appearing in various guises, sometimes stern, sometimes helpless, often naked. One particularly vivid dream placed Freud in a barbershop, where a sign read, "You are requested to close the eyes." The command seemed to echo from the grave itself. By the summer of 1897, Freud had embarked on something unprecedented in the history of medicine: a systematic analysis of his own unconscious mind. Every morning, he would lie on his office couch, notebook in hand, and let his thoughts drift like smoke. No patient had ever had such a relentless analyst, no analyst such a resistant patient. The memories that surfaced were uncomfortable, to say the least. His childhood nurse, old and ugly, who'd shown him her red-stained underwear. His mother, naked, in a train compartment. The peculiar mixture of love and rivalry he'd felt toward his nephew John, and threading through it all, like a dark river, his complicated feelings toward his father, admiration and contempt, love and disappointment, all tangled together like the root systems of ancient trees. It was during this period of intense self-scrutiny that Freud made his most audacious leap. Dreams weren't random neural firings or indigestion-induced nonsense. They were letters from the unconscious, written in a secret code. Every dream, he realized, was a wish fulfillment, though often so heavily disguised that the dreamer would never recognize the wish. Idelwu, take his dream about his patient Irma. On the surface, a simple anxiety dream about a treatment gone wrong. But as Freud dissected it, layer by careful layer, he found a web of wishes, to be absolved of responsibility for her incomplete cure, to revenge himself on uncooperative colleagues, to prove his theories correct. The dream was a little theater where his unconscious staged its desires. Night after night, Freud decoded his dreams like an archaeologist brushing dust from ancient inscriptions. He discovered what he would call the dream work, the mechanisms by which the unconscious transforms forbidden wishes into acceptable images, condensation, where multiple ideas merge into a single symbol, displacement, where emotion shifts from its real object to something safer, the whole elaborate machinery of disguise. By 1899, he was ready to share his discoveries with the world. The interpretation of dreams. Even the title was a provocation. For centuries, dreams had been the province of fortune-tellers and mystics. Now Freud was claiming them for science. The book sold exactly 351 copies in its first 6 years. But Freud knew he'd written something revolutionary. On its pages, the human mind revealed itself as stranger, more complex, and more fascinating than anyone had dared imagine. Chapter 6. The Birth of Psychoanalysis. The new century arrived, like a nervous patient, full of symptoms nobody quite understood. Electric lights were replacing gas lamps. Automobiles puttered down streets built for horses. And in Vienna, a middle-aged Jewish doctor was proposing that the human mind was mostly terra incognita, an unexplored continent lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Freud's consulting room at Burgas 19 had become a peculiar sort of laboratory. No test tubes or electrical equipment, just a couch covered in Persian rugs, walls lined with ancient artifacts, and the perpetual fog of cigar smoke. Here, the instruments were words, and the experiments involved journeys into the deepest recesses of the human psyche. The unconscious, that was Freud's radical proposition, that most of our mental life happens in darkness, beyond the reach of conscious awareness. Not just forgotten memories tucked away in some mental filing cabinet, but a seething cauldron of desires, fears, and impulses, all pressing for expression, all held in check by the thin ice of civilization. Picture the mind as a house, the conscious part, that's just the well-lit parlor where we receive guests. But below, in the cellar, that's where the real action happens. Down there, primitive wishes clash with moral prohibitions, childhood traumas fester like untended wounds, and the wild, amoral creature we once were still prowls in the shadows. Repression was the gatekeeper. When thoughts or feelings proved too disturbing, too incompatible with our image of ourselves, the mind simply shoved them downstairs. But here's where it gets interesting. Repressed material doesn't just disappear. It seeks other outlets, emerging in dreams, slips of the tongue, neurotic symptoms, even the jokes we tell at dinner parties. Then came the bombshell that would make Freud's name simultaneously famous and infamous: infantile sexuality. Children, he announced to a horrified world, were not innocent angels, but little bundles of erotic energy. From birth, humans were pleasure-seeking creatures, and this search for satisfaction unfolded in predictable stages. First, the oral stage. Watch any baby, and you'll see how the mouth becomes the center of their universe. Then, anal, as the child discovers the peculiar pleasure of holding back and letting go. Finally, around age 4 or 5, the phallic stage, where the real drama begins. Enter Oedipus, that tragic Greek king who killed his father and married his mother. Freud borrowed this ancient myth to describe what he saw as the central crisis of childhood. Every little boy, he claimed, falls in love with his mother and sees his father as a rival. Every little girl, well, that was more complicated, and Freud would spend years trying to work it out. The successful resolution of this complex determined everything: personality, morality, the capacity for love and work. Get stuck, and you'd spend your life playing out the same childhood drama with new actors. By 1901, Freud had shown that this unconscious revealed itself everywhere. The psychopathology of everyday life catalogued the 1,000 ways our hidden minds betray themselves, forgetting a name, bungling an action, making a slip of the tongue. These weren't random mistakes, but meaningful revelations, little windows into the basement of the psyche. Chapter 7: The Wednesday Psychological Society. Wednesday evenings in Vienna, 1902. After the shops had closed and the coffee houses had filled with their usual crowd of intellectuals and idlers, a different sort of gathering was taking place at Bergasse 19. Up the dark staircase, past the waiting room with its respectable furniture, a small group of men assembled in Freud's study, ready to explore territories that respectable society preferred to ignore. They called themselves the Wednesday Psychological Society, though society was perhaps too grand a word for those early meetings. 4 men initially: Wilhelm Stekel, a physician with a talent for symbol interpretation and a loose relationship with the truth; Alfred Adler, intense and argumentative, already chafing at Freud's theories; Max Kahane and Rudolf Reitler, early disciples who would later fade from history like underdeveloped photographs. The ritual was always the same: black coffee and cigars, the fuel of Viennese intellectual life. Then someone would present a paper or a case history, followed by discussion that could range from brilliant insight to bitter argument. Freud presided like a benevolent monarch, though the benevolence could evaporate quickly if someone challenged his fundamental premises. As word spread through Vienna's medical underground, the circle grew. By 1906, there were 17 members crowding into Freud's study. Otto Rank, the son of an artisan, brilliant and devoted, who'd written a book on the artist before he'd even met Freud. Hans Sachs, who would become the loyal keeper of the flame. Paul Federn, whose son would later describe these meetings as having the atmosphere of the foundation of a religion. And that was precisely the problem. Freud insisted he was founding a science, but the dynamics felt more like a mystery cult. There were the initiated and the outsiders, orthodox interpretations and heresies, a charismatic leader whose word carried the weight of revelation. Members competed for Freud's approval like courtiers vying for a king's favor. The discussions could be electrifying. One evening, Isidor Sadger presented his analysis of the homosexual writer Conrad Ferdinand Meyer. Another night brought debates about the psychology of cooking. Was the kitchen a symbolic womb? Were certain foods inherently erotic? No topic was too strange, too intimate, or too controversial for the Wednesday circle. But tension simmered beneath the surface. Adler was developing his own ideas about organ inferiority and the will to power. Stekel's interpretations grew increasingly wild. Every dream symbol was sexual. Every tower a phallus, every cave a vagina. Freud himself could be cutting, dismissive, particularly when someone suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, not everything came down to sex. The minutes of these meetings, meticulously kept by Otto Rank, read like the chronicle of a revolution in progress. Here were men, and they were all men, Vienna's prejudices running deep, attempting to map the unmapped territories of the human soul. They were explorers without charts, making it up as they went along. By 1908, the Little Wednesday gathering had outgrown Freud's study. The first International Psychoanalytic Congress in Salzburg announced to the world that this was no longer just a Viennese curiosity. 42 participants came from across Europe, eager to learn about this new science of the mind. The movement had begun, but movements, Freud was about to learn, have a way of moving beyond their founder's control. Chapter 8. The Rise and Fall of the Crown Prince. The letter arrived from Zurich in 1906 like a gift from the gods. Carl Jung, young, brilliant, and most importantly, not Jewish, had read The Interpretation of Dreams and wanted to correspond. For Freud, trapped in what he called the Jewish national affair of Viennese psychoanalysis, here was his ticket to universal recognition. Their first meeting in 1907 lasted 13 hours. 13 straight hours of talk, as if they were trying to download entire libraries of thought into each other's minds. Jung was everything Freud could have wished for in an intellectual heir, charismatic, learned with one foot in the respectable world of Swiss psychiatry and the other in the wild territories of mythology and mysticism. When the empire I founded is orphaned, Freud wrote to Jung, no one but Jung shall inherit the whole thing. The language itself reveals everything. Empires, orphans, inheritance. This wasn't just professional collaboration, but something far more primal. A father seeking a son worthy of his legacy. For a few glorious years, it worked. Jung became president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, editor of the yearbook, Freud's chosen vessel for carrying psychoanalysis beyond the cafes of Vienna. They analyzed each other's dreams in letters that ran to dozens of pages. When Jung confessed his own erotic tangles, Freud responded with paternal wisdom and barely concealed delight at such intimate confidence. But fault lines were already forming. Jung couldn't swallow Freud's insistence that libido was always sexual. What about religious experience? What about the collective patterns that seem to repeat across all human cultures? While Freud dug into individual childhoods, Jung was excavating mythology, finding universal symbols that seemed to predate any personal trauma. The break, when it came, was as messy as any divorce. It started with small disagreements. A different interpretation here, a theoretical quibble there. But by 1912, their letters had turned cold, formal, addressed to "Dear Doctor" instead of "Dear Friend." Jung began having dreams of Freud as a petrified customs official, rigid and lifeless. The final blow came at the Munich conference in 1913. Jung was lecturing about Egyptian pharaohs when Freud suddenly fainted, the second time he'd collapsed in Jung's presence. Later, Freud would interpret these fainting spells as his unconscious recognition that Jung wished him dead. Perhaps he was right. The rest is silence, Jung wrote after their final exchange. But it wasn't. Not really. Both men would spend years working through the grief and rage of their split. Jung would develop his own analytical psychology, with its collective, unconscious, and archetypal patterns. Freud would tighten his grip on psychoanalytic orthodoxy, excommunicating heretics with papal efficiency. The crown prince was dead. Long live the king, alone on his throne, surrounded by courtiers but trusting no one quite the same way again. Chapter 9. Therapy, Technique, and the Classic Case Histories. In the annals of psychoanalysis, they're known by their nicknames: Dora, Little Hans, the Rat Man. Real people reduced to case studies, their most intimate secrets preserved like specimens in amber. These were Freud's proving grounds, where theory met the messy reality of human suffering. Dora arrived in 1900, 18 years old and furious. Real name, Ida Bauer. She suffered from a shopping list of hysterical symptoms: chronic cough, loss of voice, suicidal thoughts. But what really brought her to Freud's couch was a sordid family drama involving her father's affair and his friend's unwanted advances. Freud thought he understood her perfectly. Every symptom had its meaning. The cough represented oral sex. The voice loss her unspoken desires. When Dora described her disgust at Herr K's kiss, Freud insisted she'd actually wanted it. No wonder she quit after 11 weeks, slamming the door on her way out. Even Freud later admitted he'd missed something crucial: Dora's feelings for Frau K, not her husband. Little Hans was different. A 5-year-old boy terrified of horses, analyzed mostly through letters from his father. The boy's fear started after seeing a horse collapse in the street, but Freud detected deeper currents. The horse was the father. The falling was castration. The whole phobia, a elaborate costume drama starring the Oedipus complex. Most fascinating was Ernst Lanzer, the Rat Man, a young lawyer tormented by obsessive thoughts involving rats, torture, and the people he loved. His fantasies were so disturbing he could barely speak them aloud. Rats boring into anuses, elaborate punishments that might befall his father and fiancée. Freud treated him for just under a year, unraveling the knots of love and hate that tied the young man to his dead father. The treatment notes run to nearly 300 pages, a detective story where every compulsion hides a wish and every ritual wards off a fear. The rat man was eventually cured, or at least improved enough to function. These cases became psychoanalysis' founding myths, teaching stories passed down through generations of analysts. They showed the method in action, the patient on the couch, free associating while Freud listened with his evenly suspended attention, waiting for the unconscious to reveal itself. But they also revealed the method's limitations. Real people proved messier than theory predicted, their symptoms more stubborn, their resistance more creative. The talking cure worked sometimes, but never quite as neatly as Freud hoped. Chapter 10: Psychoanalysis and Culture. By 1907, Freud had grown restless with the consulting room. Why stop at individual neuroses when all of human culture lay waiting to be psychoanalyzed? Art, literature, religion, surely they were all symptoms, writ large, collective dreams demanding interpretation. His first major foray was an essay on Jensen's Gradiva, a novel about an archaeologist obsessed with an ancient relief. Freud dissected it like one of his patient's dreams, finding repressed desires and childhood memories the author probably never knew he'd embedded. Writers, he declared, were doing psychoanalysis without knowing it, transforming their unconscious conflicts into public entertainment. Then came Leonardo da Vinci. In 1910, Freud published a full psychoanalytic biography based on a single childhood memory, Leonardo's dream of a bird putting its tail in his mouth. From this slender thread, Freud wove an entire tapestry. Leonardo's homosexuality, his creative inhibitions, his scientific curiosity, all traced back to an intense early relationship with his mother. Never mind that Freud had mistranslated the bird. It was a kite, not a vulture. Never mind that the childhood memory might have been fantasy. What mattered was the method, the audacious claim that you could psychoanalyze the dead through their works. Religion got the full treatment in Totem and Taboo. Freud imagined humanity's primal scene, brothers banding together to kill and eat their tyrannical father, then creating religious rituals out of guilt. God was simply the murdered father writ large, communion, a sanitized cannibalistic feast. Every Sunday, Christians were unknowingly reenacting humanity's original crime. But it was Michelangelo's Moses that really captured Freud's imagination. He visited the statue obsessively whenever in Rome, sitting before it for hours, like a patient before an analyst. What was Moses thinking at that frozen moment? Was he about to smash the tablets in rage, or had he just mastered his anger? After countless visits and 3 separate essays, Freud decided Moses was caught in the act of self-control, rage transforming into restraint. It was Freud's own struggle carved in marble, the wild id tamed by the civilizing superego. These cultural excavations thrilled Freud more than any patient. Here was proof that psychoanalysis wasn't just medicine, but a new way of understanding everything humans created. Art was sublimated desire. Religion was collective neurosis. Culture itself was the magnificent compromise between what we want and what we can't have. Critics howled, of course. Art historians, theologians, and anthropologists lined up to point out Freud's errors, but he'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. After Freud, no one could look at a painting or read a book without wondering what unconscious wishes lurked beneath. Chapter 11. The Great War and the Death Drive. August 1914. The lamps were going out all over Europe, and Freud, like millions of others, was caught up in the fever. "All my libido goes to Austria, Hungary," he wrote in those first delirious weeks. His sons, Martin and Ernst, enlisted immediately. Even the pacifist Freud felt his blood stirring with ancient tribal loyalties. But the romance died quickly, suffocated in mud and poison gas. The telegraph brought news that made the unconscious seem tame by comparison. Hundreds of thousands dead at the Somme, boys walking into machine gun fire, generals treating soldiers like figures on a map. Freud's own consulting room filled with the war's wreckage, officers who couldn't stop shaking, men who relived the same explosion every night. These war neuroses shattered one of psychoanalysis' founding assumptions. Here were traumatic symptoms that had nothing to do with childhood sexuality or repressed desires. Shell-shocked soldiers dreamed not of wish fulfillment, but of the very experiences they desperately wanted to forget. The repetition was mechanical, demonic, as if some malevolent force compelled them to revisit their worst moments. By 1915, Freud's initial optimism had curdled into profound pessimism. In Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, he stripped away civilization's pretenses. Humans hadn't progressed beyond their primitive ancestors. They'd simply learned to hide their bloodlust behind flags and anthems. The war revealed what psychoanalysis had always suspected. Scratch the surface of any civilized person, and you'll find a barbarian. Food grew scarce in Vienna. Freud's cigars, his sweet habit, became impossible to find. He burned furniture to heat his office, conducted analyses wrapped in overcoats. Martha queued for hours for a bit of horsemeat. The empire that had nurtured psychoanalysis was dying, and something was dying in Freud too. It was from this darkness that his most radical revision emerged. In 1920s, beyond the pleasure principle, Freud proposed something that shocked even his followers, the death drive. Alongside Eros, the life instinct that seeks connection and creation, lurked Thanatos, an equally powerful urge toward dissolution, destruction, return to the inorganic. "Watch children playing," he said. "They don't just seek pleasure, they compulsively recreate unpleasant experiences." His grandson, Ernst, separated from his mother, played a game with a wooden spool, throwing it away and reeling it back, chanting, "Fort da," gone, there, over and over, mastering loss through repetition. But it went deeper than child's play. The compulsion to repeat, the lure of destruction, the strange satisfaction in suffering, these pointed to something fundamental in the human psyche. Life itself was a detour, a temporary disturbance in the peace of non-existence. "The aim of all life is death," Freud wrote, a sentence that sent shivers through even his most devoted followers. Chapter 12. The Cancer Years and the Price of Popularity. April 1923. Freud noticed something in his mouth, a small growth on his jaw and palate. "Be prepared to see something you won't like," he told his doctor. The diagnosis came back like a death sentence written in medical Latin: epithelioma, cancer. The cigar smoker's inevitable reckoning had arrived. The first operation was bungled by a rhinologist who nearly let Freud bleed to death on the operating table. Future surgeries would be performed by Hans Pichler, who became as constant a presence in Freud's life as any patient. 33 operations over 16 years, each one carving away more of his jaw, until eating became torture and speaking an act of will. They fitted him with a prosthesis, a monstrous device he called the monster, that had to be removed and cleaned daily. It never fit properly, turning every meal into an ordeal, every cigar into defiance. Yet Freud kept smoking, kept seeing patients, kept writing. When asked why he didn't quit cigars, he replied that creativity and tobacco were inseparable for him. Better to die productive than live diminished. Death stalked him in other forms too. January 1920, his daughter Sophie, radiant Sophie, dead of influenza at 26, leaving 2 small children. Freud called her our Sunday child, the one who brought light into every room. He claimed to feel only resignation, but friends noticed how he aged overnight. Then came the cruelest blow. Little Heinil, Sophie's younger son, the grandfather's favorite, developed tuberculosis. For months, Freud allowed himself to hope. But in June 1923, the boy died. This time, Freud's stoicism cracked. "I have never experienced such grief," he wrote. Life, he said, had lost all meaning. Meanwhile, psychoanalysis was conquering the world without him. The 1920s saw Freud become what he'd never wanted to be, a celebrity. His ideas seeped into common parlance. People had complexes, made Freudian slips, repressed their true feelings. American newspapers wanted interviews. Hollywood offered contracts. Patients arrived, believing a few sessions would unlock the secrets of happiness. The popularization appalled him. His complex theories were reduced to cocktail party chatter about sex. Charlatans set up shop as analysts with no training beyond reading his books. In America especially, psychoanalysis became a commodity, something you purchased to improve your life, like a new car or a face cream. What good can come of it? He complained when offered vast sums for his memoirs. Fame brought money, useful given Austria's economic chaos, but it also brought vulgarization. His life's work was being turned into what he despised most, an American self-help scheme, all surface optimism with no acknowledgement of life's tragic dimensions. Yet he kept working, the dying man at his desk, wrestling with questions that grew darker as his body failed. What drives human destructiveness? Why do we repeat our worst mistakes? How much suffering can civilization justify? The cancer wasn't just killing him. It was teaching him about the intimate dance between life and death. Chapter 13. The Psychology of Women. The great question that has never been answered, Freud confessed to Marie Bonaparte, and which I have not yet been able to answer, despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is, what does a woman want? The admission came late in his career, after decades of confident pronouncements about the human psyche. Women, it seemed, remained psychology's dark continent. The problem had nagged at him since the early days. His hysterical patients were mostly women, yet his theories were built on the male model, as if the little boy's psyche was the standard, and the little girl's a puzzling deviation. By the 1920s, this lopsidedness had become impossible to ignore. His solution was characteristically bold and characteristically wrong. Anatomy is destiny, he declared, borrowing Napoleon's phrase. The little girl's development hinged on a terrible discovery. She lacked a penis. This absence, Freud argued, shaped everything: her personality, her morality, her capacity for culture. Picture the scene he imagined: a little girl catching sight of her brother or playmate, recognizing instantly her own deficiency. She has seen it and knows that she is without it and wants to have it. From this moment of recognition flowed penis envy, as inevitable as the tides and just as powerful. The consequences cascaded through development. Boys feared castration and resolved their Oedipus complex quickly, developing strong superegos. But girls, already castrated, had no such motivation. They turned from mother to father, hoping to receive from him what nature had denied. When this too failed, they might accept a baby as substitute, the feminine destiny of motherhood, born from original disappointment. Even Freud's female disciples squirmed. Karen Horney fired back with her own theory of womb envy. Perhaps men's achievements were just compensation for their inability to create life. Helene Deutsch, devoted as she was, wondered if masochism was really woman's natural state. Young Anna Freud, analyzing her own development with her father, must have had her own thoughts about penis envy. Lou Andreas Salome, that magnificent Russian who'd loved Nietzsche and Rilke before discovering psychoanalysis, challenged Freud gently but persistently. Woman's psychology couldn't be understood as failed masculinity. It had its own logic, its own completeness. But Freud, usually so sensitive to unconscious resistance, seemed deaf to these voices. The irony was palpable. Here was the man who'd discovered the unconscious, mapped the dream world, decoded the language of symptoms, yet half of humanity remained illegible to him. He'd spent his career listening to women's stories, built his theories on their suffering, but somehow never quite heard what they were saying. We know less about the sexual life of little girls than of boys, he admitted in 1926. We need not feel ashamed of this distinction. After all, the sexual life of adult women is a dark continent for psychology. The explorer had finally found a territory he couldn't map. Chapter 14. Human Nature at Work, Civilization, and its Discontents. The question came to him while vacationing in the Alps, watching civilization spread across the pristine landscape like a rash. Hotels where meadows had been, railways cutting through ancient valleys, tourists photographing what they were simultaneously destroying. Was this progress? Or was humanity building its own beautiful prison? By 1927, Freud was ready to psychoanalyze not just individuals, but civilization itself. The future of an illusion fired the opening salvo, a demolition of religion so thorough it left rubble where comfort had been. God was nothing more than an exalted father, he argued, projected onto the cosmos by humans too frightened to face reality alone. Religious ideas were illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest and most urgent wishes of mankind. The wish for protection, for justice, for meaning in a universe that offered none. Believers were children refusing to grow up, clinging to fairy tales because truth was unbearable. Science alone offered real hope, cold comfort perhaps, but at least honest. The book scandalized even some psychoanalysts. Was nothing sacred, but Freud was just warming up. In 1930, he published his masterpiece of cultural criticism, Civilization and Its Discontents. If religion was an illusion, civilization itself was a kind of magnificent neurosis. The arithmetic was brutal. Civilization demanded that we renounce our most basic instincts, aggression, sexual freedom, the simple pleasure of doing whatever we pleased. In return, it offered safety, culture, the comfort of belonging, but the cost kept rising while the rewards felt increasingly hollow. Consider love, Freud said. Civilization preached universal brotherhood, commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves. But why should we? Our neighbors were at best indifferent, at worst cruel. The commandment to love everyone equally was like asking someone to heat the universe. Noble in theory, impossible in practice, and ultimately a waste of precious warmth. The real truth was darker. Man is a wolf to man, homo homini lupus. Given the chance, humans would exploit, humiliate, torture, and kill their fellows. Civilization's rules weren't expressions of our higher nature, but desperate dams against our destructiveness. And like all dams, they leaked. The repressed aggression didn't disappear. It turned inward as guilt. Modern humans were neurotic, not by accident, but by necessity, paying for their safety with their happiness. Each advance in civilization tightened the screws. More rules, more guilt, more unconscious rage seeking outlet. The fateful question for the human species, Freud concluded, was whether civilization could master the death drive before it destroyed everything. Writing as fascism spread across Europe, he wasn't optimistic. Eros and Thanatos were locked in combat, and the outcome was desperately uncertain. The book sold brilliantly. Nothing sells like bad news delivered with style, but Freud took no satisfaction in his success. He diagnosed the disease perfectly. The cure, if one existed, remained maddeningly out of reach. Chapter 15. To Die in Freedom. The Nazi Threat and Final Years. January 30th, 1933. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and Freud, watching from Vienna, permitted himself a grim joke. My language is German. My culture, my attainments are German. I considered myself German intellectually, until I noticed the growth of anti-Semitic prejudice in Germany and Austria. Since that time, I prefer to call myself a Jew. The bonfires came that May. In Berlin's Bebelplatz, students hurled 20,000 books into the flames, while Goebbels proclaimed the death of Jewish intellectualism. Freud's complete works made excellent kindling, apparently. What progress we are making, he observed. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books. Still he stayed in Vienna, that abominable city he'd always claimed to hate but couldn't seem to leave. Friends begged him to emigrate. Ernest Jones flew in from London with escape plans. Marie Bonaparte offered her wealth and connections. But Freud was 81, riddled with cancer, rooted like an old tree. This is my post, he insisted, and I can never leave it. March 12th, 1938, the Anschluss, Austria's union with Germany, though rape would be the better word. Nazi thugs roamed Vienna's streets, while good citizens watched their Jewish neighbors scrub sidewalks with toothbrushes. The Bergaz apartment was searched repeatedly. The Gestapo helped themselves to the Psychoanalytic Association's bank account. What finally broke Freud's resistance wasn't his own danger, but Anna's. His daughter, his Antigone, his intellectual heir. The Gestapo had taken her for questioning. She returned unharmed after hours that aged Freud years. That night, he agreed to leave. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by Titus, he said, Rabbi Jochanan ben Zakkai asked for permission to open a school at Jabneh for the study of the Torah. We are going to do the same. The escape required Byzantine negotiations, exit visas, transit papers, ransom money. Marie Bonaparte paid a fortune disguised as taxes. Even then, the Nazis demanded one last humiliation. Freud had to sign a statement that he'd been well treated. He complied, adding a line dripping with the irony that had sustained him through life. I can most highly recommend the Gestapo to everyone. June 4th, 1938. The Orient Express carried Freud across Europe, preparing for war. In Paris, Marie Bonaparte waited on the platform with champagne. In London, the Freuds found refuge in a Hampstead house that would become psychoanalysis' final headquarters. He had 15 months left. The cancer had invaded too deeply for any more operations. When the pain became unbearable, he reminded his doctor Max Schur of an old promise. On September 21st, 1939, Schur administered 3 injections of morphine. Freud slipped into a coma and died at 3 in the morning of September 23rd. He'd kept his promise to himself, to die in freedom, an unbeliever to the end. His last days spent reading Balzac and seeing patients. The old explorer had made his final journey. Epilogue: The couch that changed the world. And so our journey through Freud's life comes to rest, like a patient at the end of a long analysis. The man who taught us that we are strangers to ourselves left behind a legacy as complex as the human mind he tried to map. His theories have been challenged, revised, sometimes discarded, yet we still make Freudian slips, still speak of the unconscious, still recognize that our past haunts our present in ways we barely understand. Walk through any city today, and you'll find his descendants, therapists, and counselors helping people make sense of their inner worlds through talking. The couch has multiplied into millions of spaces where people dare to speak their unspeakable thoughts. Perhaps that's Freud's truest legacy. Not any particular theory, but the radical idea that our mental suffering has meaning, that our symptoms are stories waiting to be heard. The boy from Freiburg, who wanted to understand everything, ended up showing us how little we understand ourselves. And in that humbling recognition, perhaps, lies the beginning of wisdom. Sweet dreams, and see you in the